I'm joined by Shami Chakrabarti, Labour's Shadow Attorney General. Shami, great to have you on the show. You've spent your whole life campaigning for freedoms, for civil liberties. We are clearly in the most extraordinary, unprecedented of times. But how do you really feel about this coronavirus law?
Well, Dan, here's the thing. You're quite right. I've spent my whole life campaigning for civil liberties and human rights, but the right to life is a very important human right. And I never thought that I would ever be giving even qualified support for this kind of legislation, that we have to save some lives. We have to flatten that curve, not just in the UK, but all over the world. And so, yes, there are now measures to shut down gatherings and shut down schools and some of the things that you've been discussing with the police. I never thought I would have to support those measures, but we have been able to work with the government and persuade them to and work with them on some safeguards. The Human Rights Act still applies. The exercise of these powers will still be subject to judicial review if they are abused. There are time limits. Parliament will get to vote in 6 months' time, and there'll be an absolute 2-year limit. We've tried our best to put in some safeguards in the short time available, but I have to say to you, we have to save human life. We have to fight.
No, and I agree.
Terrible, terrible virus.
I do agree, but can I just ask you about a couple of specifics?
Of course.
So, increased police powers, do you worry that police could use these in a racist manner?
So, Dan, here's the thing. There's always that danger. There's always that danger that we've seen in the past, power stop and search being disproportionately used against particular groups. That's the nature of power. It's not the police. It's if you give a human, sweeping power, there's that risk of abuse. But I've been listening to senior police officers overnight, including on your show and on other shows, that they're going to work really, really hard. They don't want to break with a generally positive tradition of policing by consent in this country. And so I think that they will have to play catch up with everybody else, and they will no doubt be asking their constables and their officers to use these powers as gently as possible.
No,
but I heard one of your reports that people were having a barbecue. 20 people were having a barbecue
in Coventry.
Even after yesterday's escalation of power. So I'm really sorry to say this, but sometimes...
But that's why we need these laws.
Sometimes you do need these laws.
But look, it's not just about the police. So after this legislation goes through, you can be sectioned by one doctor, whereas previously you needed 2. Isn't that open to an abuse of power, Shami?
It absolutely is, Dan. Here is the dilemma that I have been struggling with for some weeks, and I know people in government have as well, because we're trying to be bipartisan about this. These are powers that if you read about them in a novel, you would think they came from a very different society than this. The problem is the nature of this crisis, and it is spread from human to human, and the front line is the NHS, and our NHS has been depleted by 10 years of austerity, and we might be overwhelmed partly by this virus and human behaviour and partly by a lack of resources. And so even I, with all my concerns that you seem to share about how easy it could be to abuse the power to section people, not even deliberately but just accidentally, even with that concern, we have to allow for the possibility that there won't be enough doctors. One thing I can say to you, though, is that these powers can be turned on and off. You don't have to have them all turned on at the same time. So we don't need to turn on that power, for example, to section people with just one doctor, unless we get to that point where the NHS say that they really need it.
I mean, you can be detained now under this law just for failing to self-isolate. I mean, it's pretty extreme, isn't it, given that how can that actually be defined, given that right now we are able to leave our house, for example, for exercise once a day?
You're so right to identify all of these enormous challenges. We hope, of course, and believe that in the great majority of cases, now that people are waking up to the seriousness of this, that these powers will not have to be used. And I for one, will not rest until we can have a party that legislation has been repealed.
So
But
you can guarantee that as soon as we're through this crisis, you will do all you can to ensure that this
I mean,
law is repealed.
Human rights is like a religion to me. It's like a universal human religion to me. It's something that, we fought for, and our grandparents and parents fought for all over the world. There are some protections in this legislation, but it is very, very chilling, sweeping legislation.
Yeah, and the reason it is there, and by the way, I do support the law, despite asking you, because we've got to pick up on these specific points, but I understand why the law is there. What we're all very worried about, Shami, right now, and I had a top scientist on the last hour, is that are we not just on an inevitable march to end up like Italy right now?
Well, that is more for the doctors and the medics. I am worried.
What do you think? Are you concerned?
I'm hugely concerned. And that is why my colleague Jonathan Ashworth, the Shadow Health Secretary, actually called yesterday morning for the government to escalate its strategy and to start enforcing social distancing. And I supported him in that, and I'm a lifelong human rights campaigner. It's because we are looking at Italy very closely, and we are looking at a situation where we might be just 2 weeks behind Italy, and it is on our consciences, each and every one of us, not just in Parliament, but each and every person in our society has to look at Italy and say, what can I do? And I'm not someone who says it's all about individual responsibility. It's about collective responsibility.
Well, then, did we do too little, too late? Then should Boris Johnson have instituted this type of more draconian lockdown 2 weeks ago? Because New Zealand and Australia now, both countries which are weeks behind us, have already put in place the same type of lockdown that we only just instituted last night.
Well, that is the kind of review that will have to happen after we've got through this particular moment, and I will leave it to others. I will leave it to the others to conduct the inquiry and the review after the fact. For now, I have to use this great opportunity of being on your show to on the one hand, urge people to follow the advice, but on the other hand, urge government to make sure that people have clear information about who is and who isn't an essential worker, for example.
Yeah.
And in particular, government has to give people that cushion of economic support. People need to know that they will be...
Well, I want to ask you about that in 1 second, actually. But just before I do, it's interesting to note the YouGov polling, which does show that 94% of Labour voters support Boris Johnson's handling of these extra powers of the lockdown right now. What do you think of his handling of the crisis overall? Do you think the Prime Minister's done a good job?
I think that I think that if that's what Labour voters are saying, it's because we're all trying to be bipartisan in this moment of not just national crisis, international crisis. I am not going to I do not want to make party political points at this stage. What I will say is I want us to have greater clarity and consistency in communication. I want us to have greater clarity in the policy. Who is and who isn't an essential worker? What can you do if your employer is irresponsible and is urging you to go to work and refusing to pay you if you don't and you feel unsafe? And in particular, I want the government to do something for the self-employed, for the people.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you about that.
That's not a party political point. That is me.
But it is coming, isn't it?
Well, it needs to come fast, because if it doesn't, people will go out.
Yeah, and people are terrified.
And people are terrified, and people need, for example, to believe there's going to be food security in this country so that they don't panic buy, right? So the government needs to give greater clarity, greater comfort, greater support.
Now, Shami, given that you have been so clear and so responsible about not making party political points today, I presume that you agree with me that Ian Lavery, the Labour Party chairman, at the very least has to apologise and potentially resign in this private recording, which has been published by the Guido Fawkes website, saying that coronavirus is a great opportunity for the Labour Party.
Well, I didn't hear the recording, but I did speak to Ian Lavery when I read the reports. And
What did he say?
He's really, really upset that his remarks have been taken out of context. He says, and I know Ian, he's a colleague, he says that he was trying to rouse Labour members, who are like more than 500,000 people in this country, probably closer to 600,000, to become a volunteer force in their communities. Because obviously we've suspended campaigning, we have postponed elections, and he was saying that it was an opportunity for them to show what they can do in their communities.
Well, look, this is what he had to say. I'll play it and you can react off the back.
We're going to see lots of our own people dying as a consequence. But, you know, apart from that, it's going to give the fantastic battalion of Labour Party members, community champions out there, a great opportunity of showing how Labour and why Labour is best when it gets from the front foot, and it's best when it brings people together. What a great opportunity it's going to give us.
Now,
so
that's making quite a political point, isn't it?
Well, no, here's the thing. Here's the thing, Dan. That is not how I would have put it, because but look, you know, Ian and I, you can imagine, we've got very different ways of speaking. But what I've just heard.
So why not just apologise? He should just apologise.
Well, listen, because he is saying that he was urging people to get out there in the community and help people. So he doesn't want to apologise for that. And he's really upset that this little clip has been taken out of context. He's you know, he was a miner. He knows about people dying before their time, and it's not something that he would ever celebrate. And he doesn't celebrate it in that clip. He's urging these Labour members to convert their activity from what was previously campaigning activity into community activity. If he didn't put it the way that you or I would have put it, he has to put it. He put it in his own voice. But that was his intention. That's what he told me.
Okay.
Anyway.
And Shami, can I just ask you finally? I am very, very disgusted and concerned about the Chinese government's lack of action over the wet markets, which have now not only created the SARS epidemic, almost certainly been responsible for this new pandemic. Does Labour have a policy on these wet markets and what the Chinese government should be doing to abolish them once and for all?
Well, clearly Labour's not a party operating in China, and I've got all sorts of concerns about the Chinese government, not least the death penalty and all sorts of social control. But what I will say is this: after this particular crisis is over, I do think that not just in the UK but all over the world, we should be uniting, as people did after World War II, by the way, to re-establish an international rules-based order. And that is about things like human rights. That is about things like adequacy of healthcare. That is about things like tackling the climate emergency. And that is about sort of standards about food and animals and so on. But I don't think it's helpful, and I know you're not doing this, but I know that sometimes President Trump has. It's not helpful to do anything that suggests that this virus has a nationality attached to it.
No, but I am blaming the Chinese government because they try, if you look at it, they did try and cover up in the early days of this virus. There has been very, very solid scientific reporting that says if the Chinese government hadn't tried to cover it up, the virus would have been contained by 95% and we wouldn't be here.
Well, as with what people should have done, whether in Britain or elsewhere, I will leave that kind of post-mortem. I will leave that kind of review until after this.
But where I do agree with you, by the way, is this is about the Chinese government, not the Chinese people. And that is maybe where President Trump has not exactly been clear. But thank you so much for being here. That's Labour's Shadow Attorney General, Shami Chakrabarti. We're going to